Good afternoon. Thank you all so much for joining us today for One Health Issues of African Wildlife, a presentation by Emma Haschke. My name is Monica Blackwell, and I have the privilege of moderating this presentation. My role in the College of Veterinary Medicine and Biomedical Sciences allows me to work with amazing pre-vet and veterinary students like Emma, and faculty members who provide mentorship and conduct research in areas like wildlife ecology and conservation medicine, and friends of the college who wish to impact our initiatives. In a few moments, I'll introduce you to Emma and one of her faculty mentors, Dr. Walt Cook. Before I do that, I'd like to take a second to go over meeting hygiene for this Zoom call. Feel free, like I said, to leave your cameras on. That way Emma can see your faces, but if you don't mind, just please keep your microphones muted so we don't get any feedback. If you have a question, feel free to type it in the chat and we'll save it for the Q&A session at the end of the presentation. Emma is a biomedical sciences major and wildlife and fisheries minor from Austin, Texas. In 2019, she was part of the second cohort of A&M students to participate in the African Wildlife Conservation and Health course in Limpopo, South Africa, led by Drs. Jim Durr and Walt Cook. This course was the vision of Dr. Durr and Dr. Linda Logan, who should be joining this call, and is developed to provide biological sciences majors, pre-vet students, and veterinary students an immersive opportunity to witness African wildlife conservation medicine. While in South Africa, the students have the unique opportunity to stay at the ranch owned by Dr. Jim Myers, class of 1962. Sadly, the third run of this particular course, which was set to take place in the summer of 2020, had to be canceled due to the pandemic. Emma's experience in South Africa led her to conduct a research project in conjunction with the University Honors Program and the College of Veterinary Medicine and Biomedical Sciences. Dr. Logan was the faculty of record on her honors project. Emma was originally supposed to present this work this past March, but because of the shelter-in-place orders, her presentation unfortunately had to be canceled. Today, we are fortunate to have the opportunity to hear Emma share that same presentation with all of us. And perhaps this is the one silver lining of this pandemic. It's allowed us to get much more comfortable in this virtual environment and gives us a wider audience that wouldn't be possible if travel were required. So I'm going to hand things off now to Dr. Walt Cook, who specializes in wildlife disease management and prevention, and who is one of the lead faculty members in the Africa course in which Emma participated. Dr. Cook, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you, Monica. It's truly an honor for me to be able to introduce Emma. I met Emma several years ago through her great uncle, Dr. Bob Dittmar. Dr. Dittmar was serving as a wildlife veterinarian for the Texas Parks and Wildlife Department. He and I worked on many projects and issues together, and he was a good friend. Sadly, he was tragically killed in a helicopter accident about a week and a half ago doing bighorn sheep work. I know Dr. Dittmar was very proud of Emma. He and she shared a love for wildlife, wildlife conservation, and wildlife medicine. Emma, we send condolences to you and your family on the loss of Dr. Dittmar. As Monica mentioned, in 2019, Emma took a study abroad course to South Africa and Botswana. That course was initiated by Drs. Jim Durr and Linda Logan in 2013, and initially it was held in Nelspruit. But in 2015, I became an instructor in the course. And the year before Emma took it, the course moved to Ballwater in the Limpopo region. We're very fortunate to have an alumnus, Dr. Jim Myers, an A&M alumnus, who owns a very nice ranch in the region, and he serves as our host. In the course, we work with several well-known South African wildlife veterinarians, among those Dr. Doe Gobler, Dr. David Pretorius, and Dr. Sean Beverly. We assist them in their duties. This involves a great deal of chemical immobilization, animal capture and movement, and general health and treatment of a variety of African wildlife, many of which are privately owned. We also take a side trip to Botswana and team up with Dr. Eric Farena, who is a veterinarian for the Khama Rhino Sanctuary. Emma was a great addition to this course. She was always the first one up in the morning, was very enthusiastic and capable, and she was willing to tackle any task. Last spring, Emma took my wildlife disease course. She and her team did a great project on the zoonotic impacts of wildlife tuberculosis, and Emma tied for the high score in the class. Emma's also assisted me in taking tonsil and rectal biopsies from white-tailed deer for chronic wasting disease testing, and she assisted my graduate student, Logan Thomas, in his research of respiratory diseases of Aoudad. In all these efforts, Emma was a great help, and I really enjoyed working with her. I think you'll all be impressed with what an outstanding young conservationist Emma has become. Emma, thank you for all your assistance, and I look forward to your presentation.
Thank you so much, Dr. Cook. That was a very kind introduction. All right, so I'm going to get this screen shared. So hopefully everyone can see that all right. All right, and now I'm going to go ahead and launch into my discussion today. So again, welcome everyone today. I really appreciate seeing such a great turnout for this. This is definitely not the conventional way to present this information, but I'm still really glad I was able to reach an audience for this after all, and I appreciate everyone for hopping in the call today. So I'm going to be discussing One Health issues relating to African wildlife today, and specifically I'm going to explore how community-based approaches are essential in conserving these species. So first, I want to talk about why this is so important to understand, because I'm sure we have a mix in the audience of people that might be specifically in the veterinary or in the wildlife field, but some of you might be really removed from that too. So today I'm going to start by discussing why this is important for everyone, just even as members of the general public, to have an understanding of. So we understand why conservation is important to begin with, beyond just the emotional responses that we have to be the voices for these animals that otherwise would not have one. So in order to understand how to organize conservation efforts, you need to understand the people themselves. So conservation policy is important on a higher level, but it's essential to have community involvement in order to implement these practices and generate a long-term solution to coexisting with wildlife. It's also essential that the reality of conservation is effectively communicated to the public, as most people in highly urbanized countries today really have a disconnect from the issue itself. So this might lead to a very skewed view of how human-wildlife interactions look, which might cause a misunderstanding and therefore a lack of support and a lack of dialogue on the conservation policies that will actually make a difference. So learning the reality of human-wildlife coexistence is really essential for finding the most effective way to enact positive change. So whether this is financial or social, understanding the reality of how our actions affect the future of these species survival really is essential. So now I'm going to move on to why I find this topic interesting to begin with. So if conservation issues exist everywhere, why did I choose to focus on Africa specifically? Well, as I stated in the title of my presentation, I'm really focusing on the idea of One Health and really focusing on approaching this issue from a One Health perspective. So as stated in the mission statement of the AHEAD program, which stands for Animal and Human Health for Environmental Development, the mission statement says it looks at health and disease not in isolation, but within a given region's environmental and socioeconomic context. This is in reference to what One Health stands for. And so this program, the AHEAD program, connects everyone from veterinarians to ecologists, biologists, social and economic scientists, even agriculturalists, wildlife managers, and even public health specialists. And it unites all of these professions in the global fight for conservation. And they really are an excellent resource too in understanding what One Health community-based approaches to global wildlife issues really are. So the reality is, while we feel disconnected from these issues oftentimes, especially when referring to those all the way over in African countries, the stability of our future Earth is really dependent on these survivals. So examining the issue from a One Health perspective allows us to better understand this in context of our own health as human beings. And then moving on, choosing to examine African wildlife specifically, I made this decision because Africa provides a unique and important model due to its diverse wildlife populations, and also a combination of many government systems from these developing countries that might be in states of conflict or mismanagement. So this kind of combination of human conflict matched with the close proximity to many populations of wildlife will provide a unique model to examine. And finally, my experience abroad was heavily influential and really ultimately what got me passionate and exploring this on a deeper level. So the opportunity to expand on my classroom learning by going abroad and having a firsthand look at what wildlife conservation actually looks and what it feels like, this hands-on aspect of the experience really created a whole new appreciation for this topic. And I definitely wouldn't be talking about it if I had not had the opportunities to go abroad. So I really can't say enough thank you to Dr. Cook, Dr. Logan, and Dr. Durr for giving me that opportunity and just really inspiring me too. So here are a few pictures from the trip. I just wanted to show you all just how up close and personal we really got to get. So here, kind of starting in the upper left corner, that's me with a young sable bull. We were actually immobilizing them, transporting them, kind of working with the owners of these property to kind of work on creating herd diversity and moving around for breeding patterns and things like that. And then that top center photo, I'm actually taking the pulse in a young rhino calf's ear. That was a really unique project. We actually, this was also on a private game ranch in South Africa. We were actually working with a program that goes and infuses rhino horns with a highly concentrated chemical. And this kind of serves as a form of deterring poachers because the horns are now unusable and there's no value of them and they're actually toxic for human consumption. So you kind of advertise that your rhinos have been treated and their horns are no longer usable, so therefore poachers do not mess with your rhinos. So this is definitely a unique approach, and I'll be talking about rhino horns later on, but just kind of also an interesting project we got to work with. And then on the right side, that's a giraffe with some blinders on. It's being transported. And then you can see just a few different wildlife shots that I got as well, and that some of the other members of the group got. So definitely a phenomenal experience, and you can see just how up close and personal we really got to get with some of these species. So now I'm going to move on to kind of identifying some of the key issues of this topic, specifically in African wildlife, that I want to look at today. So my original idea for the course back when I was first developing this project had ideas that ranged from wildlife disease to captive breeding programs, all the way to private game ownership and high fencing in South Africa. But since then, for the purpose of this presentation, I have narrowed down the focus to just two topics that I feel like are the most tangible to the general public, and that's rhinos and elephants. They are widely loved and evoke a very emotional response in a lot of people that might even be removed from wildlife conservation too. So this is why that these two species and the issues surrounding these two species need to be examined a lot more in depth. And one thing I do want to specify before launching into this discussion is how complicated these issues really are. So while there are many ideas on what is the best way to handle these issues in theory, implementing the long-term solutions is a whole other thing. So while I've done my best to gather information and give my own perspective on it, there is still a lot of ongoing work on this and a lot more research that needs to be done to fully understand the reality of these issues. So with that, I'm going to move into the first topic, and that is human-elephant conflict. So first, to understand how humans are interacting with these species, we need to know where the populations of African elephants are actually located. So as you can see from this heat map, the highest concentration of elephant populations exist in the southern plains of Africa, and that's specifically in northern Botswana, which is home to actually about 1/3 of the world's African elephant populations. And there has actually been a reported sustainable increase in African elephant populations in Botswana, with population sizes originally measured in about 50,000 elephants in 1990 to up to 150,000 more recently. But however, it should also be noted that there was likely sampling error and inconsistencies in data collection, as often, is another factor that further complicates research in some of these developing countries. But while this seems like a lot of elephants, it's important to know that in more recent years, the elephant populations in Botswana have actually been declining about 15%, according to an IUCN African Elephant Specialist Group. So compared to other countries like Tanzania that have elephant population losses of about 60%, this is actually a fairly impressively low number of losses, and this can likely be attributed to the country's conservation policies that they have in place. Elephant surveillance found about a 7% carcass ratio of African elephants, which a carcass ratio is proportion of dead elephants to the live population. So this number was deemed to be stable or even increasing elephant population, as these stable populations have found to have carcasses as high as 8% and still be considered okay. So this 7% carcass ratio might appear alarming. However, the 2016 status report by the same African elephant specialist group shows that carcass ratios back in 2010 and 2012 were as low as 2%. So in as few as 4 to 6 years, we've seen an increase from 2% to 7% in these carcass ratios. So while this might still be representative of a stable elephant population, it indicates that in the coming years, we're going to start seeing some potentially dangerously high carcass ratios and contributing to their population declines. So now looking at human elephant conflict, you might hear this and think, what is this conflict? You know, elephants can get involved in politics, so how is there conflict surrounding them? Well, elephants are large-bodied mammals that may be seen as a lovable and elegant symbol of the great wonders of wildlife to some, but they pose a direct danger to the livelihood of those that are directly interacting with them. African elephants migrate over large distances in order to access water sources, as water availability drastically seasonally in a lot of these African countries. So these large movements are very natural for the elephant, but what is less natural for them is having villages and other infrastructure now being in their path. So at times when water is more scarce, elephants will even turn to accessing human water supplies too, which, as you might assume, having these animals traveling directly through your villages can be seriously dangerous. And there are unfortunately several humans each year as a result of such encounters. So these elephants also damage crops, and they might harm livestock as well as they move through fields. It really affects the economic stability of some of these communities, that especially those that rely on subsistence farming or are heavily reliant on their agricultural products to be economically stable. So however, the solution to this problem of elephants being in close proximity is not simply to remove all of them, because African elephants are essential to ecosystem stability and are actually considered a keystone species themselves. Several of their behaviors manage the vegetation of the grasslands and actually create a ripple effect on the other species of the ecosystem. So these elephants are also essential to local economy for ecotourism, as that provides an important income to a lot of these communities as well. So while this is a complicated issue, there has been some progress in bridging this gap between wildlife conservation and community safety at the same time. One of the ways we've been able to gather more information on this conflict actually looks like is through the Human Elephant Conflict Working Group, a special program created by the IUCN African Elephant Specialist Group. So this group is focused on creating resources to evaluate this issue and then make recommendations to the government and to the communities on where our understanding of the elephants are falling short. So this is where we see the One Health perspective really in action, as this group is a highly specialized task force, and they're really taking into account not only the elephant safety, but also human health and what it really looks like to be directly in contact with these species. So they're really finding the root of the community's fears in relation to these species, and they're combining these fears with an understanding of elephant social ecology too. So this task force allows for a very specific focus and a very important issue too, for wildlife conservation. As wildlife issues are constantly arising from an increasingly urbanized world, understanding these strategies, finding how this group has been successful can be useful in action and implementation of these techniques and other issues. So like I said, you can find wildlife conservation issues all around the world, but being able to see some of these highly specialized task forces and the strategies that they've taken can allow us to implement them and implement their strategies into some of the other comparable conflicts. So now I want to move on to evaluating some of this conflict that we see. So in a published report by the working group that I was previously mentioning, certain risks were evaluated and then reported on. So something interesting that was stated by the group after analyzing the results was that there was actually a gap in the perceived problem and the actual reality of the issue. So one of the ways this was found was through pest assessment. So finding the reason that there is a larger negative sentiment towards elephants specifically, compared to some of the other destructive species. Like there are several rodents that are highly destructive, a lot of suid species too. So finding why there's a larger negative sentiment towards elephants when there's just as much destruction from some of these others. And that was found to be because the economic loss resulting from elephant destruction was felt on a much more individual level rather than on a nationwide scale. So on a national level, the damage is relatively insignificant. And these damages have to be handled on an individual level in a lot of these underdeveloped communities, which creates a negative sentiment towards local elephant populations and even the formation of specific protected areas devoted to these species. We can see why these negative feelings towards wildlife coexistence are dangerous, as conservation efforts rely on local buy-in to carry out successful policy. So an evaluation of the current African elephant-related policy demonstrates a hesitance by many of these nations to develop strong policy relating to the species. They have found that these elephant issues are handled on a case-by-case basis and are kind of reactionary after the damage and the conflict has already been caused, rather than actual preventative measures. So current strategies seem to center around shooting problem elephants whenever these cases do arise, but this is shown to lack long-term effectiveness, as like I said, it's simply a response rather than a preventative approach. So thankfully, there seems to be growing acknowledgement in the need for stable and long-term policy to be incorporated in these governments' elephant management strategies. And a lot of the work done by this IUCN group has highlighted a lot of these issues and why preventative measures are so essential. So here's a chart that was actually created by the Human-Elephant Conflict Working Group. And this was a conflict management report that actually gives a better understanding of how the local communities tolerate interaction with wildlife, referring to them as pests. So these socioeconomic factors listed indicate that the tolerance to a species comes from damage relating to crops that are produced as the source of income with an already limited land relied on, and these crops being their sole source of income. So like I said, kind of those subsistence farmers, those maybe developing communities that are relying on this agricultural income. Also, whenever these economic losses are absorbed on an individual level rather than carried by community, it leads to a much more negative sentiment relating to the species. So this chart allows us to kind of view how elephant damage to local crops and agriculture creates this higher amount of tension, as tend to align elephants more in the intolerance category and how they relate to humans. This is another chart. This is kind of the second half of it. But this chart instead examines it in terms of ecological factors, such as the behavioral patterns of the pest species and the structure of the crops themselves. So as you can see, that's kind of where we're seeing the combination of that human perspective with that animal's perspective, examining how economic factors need to be taken into the animal's social behaviors in order to understand how to approach the issue. So while I mentioned that there needs to be support on a community level for successful mitigation of the issue, it's also essential to have support on all levels of the government for this to truly be successful long-term. So there has been difficulty finding solutions to the human-elephant conflict because some of the methods previously developed have been found to be expensive or really labor intensive, and oftentimes the elephants kind of learn from it and adjust to these measures and learn how to kind of avoid these deterrents over time. So for example, loud noises are a common form of elephant deterrent. So villagers actually have been known to camp out in their own fields overnight, kind of with pots and pans next to them, and when an elephant approaches, they'll actually bang the pots loudly to try to deter them. They'll even move to lighting firecrackers and firing guns to try to keep these elephants out of their fields. As you can imagine, this is very difficult to maintain and also is highly dangerous, as it's putting these people directly in front of the elephants that could become startled and become aggressive, and it's really putting them in serious harm's way. So some successful methods so far have been the use of chili bricks, which are these bricks actually made from elephant dung mixed with chilies and dried into a block, which they actually burn, and the smoke really irritates the elephants. So that has been a strategy to kind of keep the elephants away, as they're really sensitive to that chili smoke. Also, electric wire fencing has proved to be effective as well. And there's also been an interesting new development with something called beehive fencing. So this is a relatively newer tactic being used. You can actually see this in that top right picture on the slide. So elephant trunks have been sensitive to bee stings, and communities have actually begun building these beehives and fences kind of like as the first line of defense on their fields. So they put these the furthest away from their village, so they're at least, removed from the bees, and it's also kind of that first line of defense from preventing elephants from entering their fields. So in addition to deterring the elephants, these beehives are actually creating a new agricultural product for the community as well, as the honey and wax candles that they're able to get from these bees are new products that they can sell and make an additional income on. Also, there have been reports and shows that it helps engage the women of the households in a lot of these communities as well. And so while there's a lot more research that needs to be collected kind of on the areas of higher risk in order to concentrate these efforts, innovative solutions like the beehive fencing provide safer alternatives rather than kind of responsive killing of problem elephants, and local villagers are also protected in the same time. So I'm going to kind of move on to switching gears a little bit from the human-elephant conflict and looking at ivory trade and poaching. So while human-elephant conflict on the local level is not as widely discussed, elephant poaching for ivory is definitely an issue that is just in mainstream media, and anyone that knows about elephants knows about the issue with ivory too. So I won't go too into detail, as this is of course a very large issue with many, many aspects, but I really can't talk about African elephant conservation without also addressing ivory trade. So ivory trade has long been present on the eastern coast of Africa, particularly booming in the 19th and especially the 20th century. Especially as historically ivory was shipped east to India and China and Southeast Asia before markets eventually expanded to reach European and American markets too. So this is likely why our Tanzania elephant populations have been hit the hardest by poaching historically. As I said earlier, they had population declines of as high as 60%, which is pretty alarming. And Botswana has actually been known to have a thriving elephant population with a habitat range actually expanding. However, while these numbers look good for a population of elephants, poaching has been increasing recently, and carcass evaluation studies have found that deaths caused by poaching appear in hotspots, or areas where there are higher concentrations than naturally occurring deaths, which is how you can tell that poaching in that area. So while one of these hotspots that was evaluated was noted to have deaths likely attributed to circumstances like drought, most often these hotspots they found had carcasses due to poaching losses. So while the carcass ratio of Botswana still represents a stable population, this could reflect future increases in elephant poaching mortality. As you've seen in the case of Zimbabwe, they actually had a population collapse that after a period of increasing carcass ratio. After what they had what was previously considered a stable population, they eventually had a population collapse. So by 2014, the population of Zimbabwe's elephants were reported to be down by 76% of what they had been measured in the early 2000s. So while Zimbabwe had these stable populations like we see in Botswana in the early 2000s, by as recent as 2014, they had population declines of up to 76%, which is really alarming. So we see kind of these periods of slow increases in carcass ratios followed by a drastic decline. So this is why we really do need to focus on Botswana's elephant populations and how we want to preserve this large number of elephants in this area. Also, the Niassa, I don't know if I pronounced that correctly, but this is a national reserve in Mozambique. They actually saw a similar pattern of population collapse too. So this indicates that it really is essential to be proactive in policy with Botswana before we see this drastic pattern of collapse. So now I want to move on to talk about CITES. So CITES is an agreement between national governments in order to control international trade of wildlife and plant life. So while a large amount of species protected by CITES are also endangered species, this also serves to regulate the sustainable trade of other resources as well. So countries that agree to CITES or countries that decide to become parties means that they want to build national legislation around this framework that CITES recommends. So there are currently 183 countries that are participating in this. And African elephants are actually protected under Appendix 1 in all countries except for Botswana, Namibia, Zimbabwe, and South Africa that instead control African elephants as an Appendix 2 species. So Appendix 1 actually means that all trade of specimens taken from the wild are prohibited, while Appendix 2 instead states that there are rules permitting commercial trade under certain permits. So for these 4 countries, African elephant ivory is actually protecting these populations as Appendix 1 with certain annotations that allow for one-off commercial sales of stockpile ivory. So these permits allow for the legislation to be modified for the different regional populations. And this is seen with the quota system in place to try to control the trade of ivory and to try to regulate it. However, while this legislation seems really straightforward in preventing ivory trade, except for one-off sales, there is still ongoing debate about what the best way to prevent poaching actually is. So some of these countries argue that allowing regulated trade under Appendix 2 would instead create a market in order to regulate it, preventing massive deaths, but others argue that this just rather encourages a system of poaching instead. So there are also just some issues with the enforcement of these policies, as some aspects are very loosely defined and leave a lot of room for different interpretations in the legislation. So for example, there's an exemption in CITES policies for items that are not considered readily recognizable or derivative of the species. Therefore, some ivory producing countries take advantage of this and quickly carve the ivory after harvesting it, since under that definition, only raw ivory trade is technically protected. So it's important to closely monitor how elephant populations are affected in these countries in order to gauge the actual effectiveness of these policies. So now I want to really change gears and look instead at rhino horn trade. So few people hear about rhinos without thinking of the delicate status of this species. Rhino poaching in order to harvest their horns has caused really devastating impacts on the loss of these rhinos. However, rhino poaching is an issue that really needs to be addressed differently than elephant poaching for ivory. And this reason for the difference really comes down to the animal's morphology. So while tusks found in elephants are modified teeth that are actually made of dentin, they have been developed over a long evolutionary process in order to be used as valuable tools for the animal, and they're actually used in many social behaviors as well. However, rhinos, on the other hand, are very different mammals, and they're actually derived from a very different evolutionary superorder too than elephants. While they might kind of seem like the same gentle giants found in the same areas, they're actually very different animals. So while we really only find what are considered true horns in animals like bovids, like cows, goats, and even gazelle, the rhino horn itself is actually a keratinous structure that instead lacks a bony core. So keratin is a protein that is the same material that makes up our own fingernails, and that's why the devastating losses for rhinos in order to use their horn in things like medicines or status symbols is so frustrating, because these species are being wiped out over something as simple as the material that makes up a fingernail. So this also means that rhino horn trade is a very different issue because it's actually a renewable resource. Rhino dehorning is a procedure that can actually be performed without harming the rhino if done properly. There have been little to no negative effects on the animal after undergoing such a procedure if it does survive the procedure. So as you can assume by the need to continually cut down our own fingernails, rhino horn grows back as opposed to ivory that once harvested does not grow back and often kills the elephant in the process. And this is why many places, especially private game ranches, have actually started looking to dehorn their own rhinos to protect them from getting killed by poachers. And this also means that a potential solution to massive rhino mortality rates resulting from poaching is actually instead to legalize the trade of rhino horn, under strict regulation, of course, because since it is a renewable resource, there is a way to create supply without harming the animal if done properly. Over the years, there have been stockpiles developed from dehorning and from natural deaths of rhinos. This would allow for initial supplies as rhino dehorning is incorporated more into veterinary practice in order to keep up with the supply. Now, of course, this seems like a very easy fix when we say it in theory, but as you might assume, there is a lot more to this subject. So I once heard someone describe the renewable resource of rhino horn as the wool on a sheep. But I feel that that is actually a gross under-exaggeration of how this resource is actually obtained. So in order to harvest rhino horn, a veterinarian needs that are created are then filed down and smoothed, kind of to create a rounded dome on the base. So while the actual removal of the horn does not do physical harm to the animal, there is a risk anytime you're going to work with wildlife and sedate them. Their stress response can really destabilize their body condition, which requires close monitoring throughout the procedure in case the animal needs to be reversed from the medication and then released. So this really requires a skilled group that is familiar with such procedures, and I would say it requires many more tools than just the average sheep shearing. Rhino especially also tend to have issues under sedation and oftentimes getting high enough oxygen, and often require highly specialized groups to make sure that they are being properly cared for under this procedure. So while this needs to be done one animal at a time, it also makes it difficult to keep up with the horn supply. So there's a risk that opening up a trade market would not allow for dehorning procedures to keep up with the demand, which could then just perpetuate the issue and drive the animals quickly to extinction. A study I read examined simulation models focusing on disrupting the trafficking syndicates in order to protect the species. They explained it as a complementary response between regulating rhino trade and rhino horn trade and addressing the root of criminal trade, as well as creating a sustainable solution. So using individual-based ecological modeling and agent-based economic modeling allows for rhino population changes to be taken into account with the supply chain prices paid to poachers. So according to results of the economic model, a multifaceted approach should include increased protection, a reduced product demand, or legalized trade of the horn, combined with disrupting the crime syndicates that traffic the product and provide community-based economic opportunity instead to supplement this. So in terms of surveillance, technological advancements have aided in private game management. So during my trip to South Africa, I actually learned about many companies that make equipment like drones that are used specifically for wildlife surveillance against poaching. Many places have very detailed camera systems too, so these advancements have allowed for a lot better security of the species. However, unfortunately, there are still many individuals who have lost their lives manually defending rhinos from poaching. While you can have a large amount of security on these private areas, a lot of these reserves and government-owned areas really struggle protecting their species from poachers. So this is why such technologies need to be more affordable and accessible to the areas that need more surveillance, and in order to protect human lives as well. So creating economic benefit for communities and creating an economic incentive to protect the rhinos is really important, because in order to eliminate the converse economic benefit of engaging in poaching, they would otherwise have no legal economic opportunities. So you need to create solutions for these communities in order to kind of supplement this income and de-incentivizing turning to these criminal syndicates. So one way we have successfully seen community engagement in wildlife conservation is at the Khama Rhino Sanctuary. We actually got the privilege to visit this sanctuary during our trip to South Africa and Botswana. And the Khama Rhino Sanctuary is located near the village of Soroa, Botswana. And we had the privilege to visit here. And this sanctuary actually is an example of providing this economic opportunity to local villages through tourism and sustainable natural resources and incentive the protection and the conservation of these species. So this sanctuary offers visitors a close look at many African species, not just rhinos too. So while visiting the park, we had the opportunity to actually even change radio collars on an adult female rhino and a young calf, in addition to going on game drives and learning about radio telemetry in order to track species in the field. So this provided a great firsthand look at a successful sanctuary focused on returning species back to the area and creating an ecologically diverse and economic sustainable solution. So these images images that you can see here, aside from the Khama logo, were actually taken by me on the game drives in the park. And I really have no good camera experience. This is really just point and shoot. So as you can see, the wildlife really speak for themselves in these pictures. And you can actually see the image of the rhino in the bottom right corner. If you can look closely on her foot, you can actually see one of those radio collars that we got the chance to change. And you can see how that is one of the strategies used to monitor these animals in the park. But not only was the wildlife at this sanctuary phenomenal, but the locals here were very friendly, and we learned a lot from them throughout our stay. We had daily fireside chats where we would all gather around the campfire at night and talk and learn about each other and learn about the community. And of course, we went and cleaned out their gift shop too. I think we all got matching Khama Rhino Sanctuary jackets by the end of it. And it was just a phenomenal experience all around, and a really encouraging look at how successful community-based wildlife conservation really looks in practice. And as you can see from these pictures, encounters such as these would be enough to inspire anyone. So now I kind of want to briefly talk about an issue that's probably a lot more relevant to those of us that are Texans. So a lot of these wildlife issues actually have local relevance to us now too, as private exotic game management in the state of Texas really is booming. So we are really moving towards a model in Texas that very closely mirrors South African exotic animal ownership. So we see a lot of private ranchers, a lot of private game farms that are doing tourism drives, or doing hunting, things like that, that very closely mirrors what we see in South African wildlife that is highly privately owned. So this climate allows, the climate in Texas actually allows for many African wildlife species to thrive. So we've really seen a lot of species that have kind of come back from the brink that might have been struggling in Africa, brought to Texas, and now suddenly they're booming here. We've also seen a lot of economic opportunity from this industry, as it's now become over a $1 billion industry. And it's also really been able to support many rural agricultural areas that might have been struggling previously, but it's provided a lot of income. But there are still, of course, questions about what the future of this might look like in Texas and what the industry is going to become. So there's the question of, do these benefits to the economy and the conservation that it provides, increasing numbers of some of these species, but do these benefits outweigh the costs to our native Texas wildlife and to our native habitats? So as we've seen with species like the aoudad, that in the top right corner that I got the opportunity to work on with Dr. Cook, we've seen issues in West Texas as these animals really have boomed, and they've kind of outcompeted the bighorn sheep of the area, and our native bighorn sheep populations have drastically been declining, and instead we see these booms of aoudad there too. Also, a lot of these species introduced provide issues as disease vectors, as we've seen the case with the species of the nilgai, which is actually an Indian wildlife species that's been introduced, but we have problems with ticks and disease being transported with these species. So while this provides an exciting economic opportunity, and it's been kind of exciting to have a lot of these species present in Texas, we really need to take a close look at if this is going to be stable in the future, to still have stable ecosystems and wildlife habitats. So with that, I kind of want to wrap all of these topics together with the impact that behavioral science kind of has in really encompassing all of this. So while coming up with policy and conservation management strategy is important, it really doesn't mean anything unless this is put into the perspective of human behavior and human interactions. So each set of species and ecosystems provides a different set of challenges, but the one underlying commonality is needing an understanding of human beings. So not all communities are going to need the same approaches to wildlife conservation. So addressing these target audiences associated with the different issues allows for a more directed approach. So this organization also targets different strategies that can be used for incorporating change into communities. So one can motivate the change by framing the message to that person's personal values and also their identities and their interests. So making the issue personal and humanizing the message makes it more tangible for people. The change also needs to be socialized. So by increasing behavioral observability, it also increases accountability, which then creates a public and peer-to-peer commitment and an accountability to hold these people to really believing and perpetuating the change. So by promoting the change as a desirable norm, it then encourages people to move towards adopting it and incorporating it into their lifestyles for long-term solutions. So as change does not happen immediately, we also need to be able to ease the change as well. So that's why it's important to provide support with planning and the implementation of these strategies. The change can then be made easier by removing the frictions that are in place, by maybe opposing policies and promoting substitutes as the process is being implemented. So while these are very general concepts in order to change the public's mentality on issues, it shows the importance of placing the issues into context of the actual people themselves and the people that it's really going to come down to in order to enact the change and make a difference. So now I'm going to kind of be moving into my conclusion. So why is this important? I'm going to kind of loop back to why this is ultimately important for us to understand these issues. As consumers, it is important for us to know how our money is being spent and where it's going in terms of our aid that we give. So many people want to get behind the sentiment of saving the rhinos and saving the elephants and, you know, all these species that evoke very emotional responses. But then difficulties arise with what the best way to deliver the support actually is. So by empowering local communities and those individuals that have the best understanding and the direct impact on these conservation efforts is a great way to get connected with the actual issues themselves. It's also important to note that people need to be able to protect their own livelihood before they can protect that of the animals around their own community. So this is why it's important to tackle these conservation issues in tandem with the social and political unrest of regions in order to have the long-lasting involvement and long-lasting incorporation into the community. So in summary, in order to protect our ecosystems, we need community involvement on the local level with policies supported on a national level. So in order to have community involvement, there needs to be an established livelihood first. And this is where we see how essential a One Health approach actually is. We truly are all connected on this earth, as distant as we might be right now. And we really need to be able to understand this perspective if we want to continue to have rich, sustainable, and diverse ecosystems. So thank you all for attending today. I did just also want to make a comment that I wanted to dedicate this presentation to my recently passed away great uncle, Dr. Robert Dittmar. As Dr. Cook mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, he was highly influential in getting me into this topic and getting me interested in this. And he was actually the one that introduced me to Dr. Cook when I first met him a few years ago. So I owed a lot to him, and he was very influential in this for me. But I just wanted to thank you all today for joining this presentation. And I believe now, Monica, I think we're going to be going into a short Q&A session.
That's correct. Thank you so much, Emma. You did an amazing job, and I know I speak for everyone in that you would have done your uncle very, very proud. So at this time, we are going to take some questions. If anybody has a question they'd like to throw in the chat, or if you would like to use the hand raise feature, you're welcome to also ask it directly, and I will help you unmute if you need assistance. Go ahead, Mr. Johnson.
Thanks. Emma, who on the policy side of things, which countries have the best seats at the policy table on this?
When you say seats at the policy table, do you mean which countries kind of have developed the best policy?
Yeah, who's driving the policy on these issues?
I feel like from the research that I've done, I feel like many have been turning to Botswana and their models of how they've been kind of approaching these issues. There's been a lot of praise to kind of the South African models, but there's also been a lot of controversy too, as South Africa has kind of approached that very privatized look at wildlife conservation by all the increases in private game ranches. that has generated a lot of praise by how a lot of these species have really been able to increase in numbers, but it's also had it's kind of had some drawbacks too, with things like high fencing and how that affects animal natural migration patterns and other kind of specific effects that might have on the species ecology and their behaviors itself. But I feel like many have been looking to Botswana, especially in their success in large number of elephant populations, and how that's kind of been a way to preserve them on a national scale, not just through the private ownership, and still have booming populations. Does that answer your question all right?
What I'll just go to the punchline for me. What's the United States doing about it?
As far as in relation to African species, that's not quite where I dove into on my research for this project. So I haven't really been I've been looking specifically more on like the community level in the African response to it. As far as for the United States, I know a lot of that you'd have to look through their involvement in CITES and how involved they've actually been with being a part of these kind of international conferences and international parties. And I'm not quite as well read on that topic, so maybe if one of my professors has a better answer for that, then I can definitely defer to their knowledge. But
thank you.
You're welcome.
Dr. Cook or Dr. Logan or Dr. Durden, any of you guys want to jump in and fill in any of that about the United States response?
Well, I'll say a couple words.
Okay, great.
A lot of different countries in Southern Africa have done an amazing job in the last 15 or 20 years in trying to improve wildlife conservation issues. And I agree with Emma that Botswana has been pretty important, and they've done some pretty major things. So they've made some mistakes along the way too, but I think all countries have. But I would also point to Namibia, because Namibia is a young country. It's only been around as a free country for 25 years or so. But 25 or 30 years ago, there wasn't a lot of wildlife in Namibia. And they decided in the late 90s to start focusing on wildlife conservation and game farms. And it truly is an oasis now in many ways when it comes to wildlife, because there's not very many people there. It's a country the size of Texas. It's got population the size of Austin in the whole country. And but it's got a tremendous amount of wildlife, and many of those places are extremely well managed, the national park system and privately. So I would say Botswana is also a place that has kind of led the way in game management, wildlife management issues.
I think one of the things that we see also is that in Southern Africa, they have taken the approach of game farming, game cropping, hunting. In East Africa, hunting is not allowed. The animals are protected in game parks, but unfortunately, the level of poaching is high. And the populations of rhino are almost extinct, and they've also, the elephant populations have been greatly poached despite the supposed protection in national parks. So there's two different approaches being used, but I think, as Emma clearly showed, that the level of community involvement is so critical to protecting the wildlife. If the surrounding communities don't derive benefit from having these animals in their midst, it's just as beneficial for them to crop them themselves illegally as done in East Africa. So I appreciate the fact that Emma wanted to concentrate on how important it is to involve local communities. And one of the reasons that Jim and Walt and I wanted to take the students to Botswana was to see a model of where a local community had created a preserve, the Khama Sanctuary. And that was an amazing an example of how invested the community was in preserving their wildlife. Thank you.
That's great. Chase, you've got a question. You want to unmute yourself.
Okay, can y'all hear me?
Yes, sir.
Okay, so hey Emma,
We lost your audio.
oh dang it.
Oh, no, there, there. Okay, there you go.
Okay, well I just wanted to say thank you to Emma. That was a great presentation. But my question was, early on in the presentation, you were talking about recent declines in elephant populations in Botswana, and I was wondering if you saw any indication of if that had to do with the hunting closures on elephants that went into effect a few years ago, and then the recent reopenings, if for elephant hunting, if that has affected population decline, whether in a good way or a bad way, or if it's changed any carcass percentages, if you've seen anything to do with I guess the trends associated with the closing and reopening of the elephant hunting in Botswana.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I actually didn't quite take it that step further to look at it also in relation to hunting. But that's definitely a very important aspect to take into consideration, as of course, as we heard in Africa, there's a lot of discussion on relocation of elephants from Botswana elsewhere, or if the populations were actually too high and not sustainable, and how hunting actually looks in relation to that. I personally didn't look that far into it with also aligning the hunting policies with it, but you definitely bring up a very good point that that definitely needs to be taken into consideration when also addressing these carcass ratios. I looked at it a little bit more from what they gathered in relation to the hotspots of poaching that were deemed the result of poaching.
Gotcha.
But thank you for your question.
Yeah, absolutely.
Do we have any other questions? Oh, Dr. Durr, yes, sir.
So, Emma, you did a really good job of talking about what you saw and what you learned in Southern Africa. And then at the end, you brought in the private game ranch ownership here in Texas. And it's a very, very timely topic. And as you know, they've been doing game ranching in especially South Africa for 25, 30 years now. And so they've overpopulated a lot of different species. And now here in Texas, it seems to me, and I'm sure you're in a position to know as much or more than I do about it, but it seems to me like the game ranching industry is getting more and more momentum here in Texas. More and more people are interested in it. There's companies that have been put together to try to take advantage of it from a financial point of view. So my question is, can you talk a little bit about what you learned in South Africa, lessons maybe you learned about game ranching that people here in Texas that are interested in game ranching should pay attention to? Can we learn from experiences in Southern Africa as we move into this in Texas?
That's a really good point. Thank you for bringing up that question. So yes, as you kind of mentioned, we've seen that there was that great boom in the South African industry, and now they're kind of overstocked on a lot of those things. And especially as we heard from the perspective of the wildlife veterinarians, they oftentimes don't have, quite as much work as they maybe used to. And so I believe we might need to see about if it's possible to make this workable in practice, maybe regulations on certain amounts of species, or the imports of certain amount of species, maybe in order to kind of almost just kind of reduce the potential for overpopulation of certain species. So maybe surveying the land and saying, how many of this species can we support? How many of this species can we support? And also taking into context the actual ecosystems of Texas habitats too, and saying, what can we sustainably support that will also not outcompete other species to the extent of driving those out of existence? And maybe it might be from the approach of actually surveying the actual ecology of the land and seeing what we are capable of supporting and what we have the potential to support in the future in order to regulate the import and the actual population sizes of these species. And doing that from a preventative measure rather than getting out of hand and then needing to export species or even do something as drastic as opening up, euthanasia or having to reduce these species by shooting them or something like that.
It sounds to me like you're arguing that there will be a lot of jobs for wildlife biologists and wildlife veterinarians and ecologists in the state of Texas to deal with this industry over the next 20 years. And I completely agree with you.
Awesome. Thank you so much for bringing that up.
One of the things also that we've learned in South Africa, as different species were moved to different areas, the adaptability of the animals, some of them naturally were not adapted to new areas, and some never do adapt well due to diseases that they encounter and that they have no natural immunity. And I'm sure that here in Texas, we will continue to see the issues of health management as being an extremely important issue as we see bighorn sheep with lungworms and where you have overpopulations. Certainly in certain parts of Botswana, there's overpopulation of elephants, and within the last 2 months, we've seen a big crash of a big die-off of elephants, more than 300. They're still investigating to try to determine what the cause of that outbreak was. But certainly in a place like Chobe National Park that has the most elephants of any park in the world, the destruction of the ecosystem there is profound. And it's important that it's not just about conservation of elephants, but you have to have an ecologically sound approach so that you don't have too many animals so that they are totally destroying the ecosystem.
Great. Dr. Cook, do you have something to add?
Yeah, well, a couple of things. First, I forgot in the introduction, I meant to mention that Dr. Dittmar had planned on attending your session today, Emma. I wanted you to know that, and I thought that was a nice tribute at the end. And excellent job, very good job on that presentation. Just wanted to add to this discussion a little bit about the North American model of wildlife conservation is a little bit different than the model that's used in some of these other countries. And that model was based on a reaction when the Europeans came to North America and we first started. Of course, we all know the history. Initially, there was tremendous overhunting and many wildlife species faced extinction or even went extinct. And so then as we tried to correct that, the North American model was in part based on a reaction to that, but also a reaction to what had happened in Europe, where basically only the elites, basically the kings and the king's cronies, if you will, were allowed to hunt. And in North America, we wanted to say that wildlife belonged to all the people. So even here in Texas, white-tailed deer that are propagated on a breeding farm are still technically owned by the people. That's why a white-tailed deer breeder can't open up a hunting season for his deer anytime he wants. He has to follow the hunting seasons that apply to free-ranging wildlife as well. So there is a contrast with the native wildlife in North America to the exotic wildlife that get brought in from Africa, for example. Those exotics that are brought in here are legally classified as an alternative livestock species because they're not native wildlife. And so that causes some conflicts, but it also gives those breeders of those animals more flexibility because they don't have to stick to hunting seasons, for example. They certainly have to follow certain regulations in bringing those animals in and in translocating them to other places, but they have a lot more flexibility than somebody who's breeding native species.
Great. There's lots of interesting perspectives being shared on this, on the breadth of this industry. We've got a couple more questions in the chat. There's one from Logan Ford Thomas, sorry. Would developing a wildlife track for DVM students be feasible? I think that one is more of a question that either Dr. Cook or Dr. Logan or Dr. Durr, one of you guys would like to discuss that. Yeah, go ahead, Dr. Cook.
I'll address that one. Currently, the veterinary students that are really interested in wildlife, they choose the alternative track. That gives them some flexibility to do some additional things. And there are some electives that vet students can take in their second year and their third year on wildlife. And I'm plugging that because I teach a couple of them. So, but we don't have a full wildlife track. Now, UC Davis does have a wildlife track, and I kind of would support going to that notion. And as Emma and Dr. Durr and Dr. Logan have pointed out, there's going to be a lot of wildlife health issues. There already are a lot of wildlife health issues, but even as we project forward into the next 20 years, those are going to get more intense and more frequent. So I think an argument could be made that we should have one, a wildlife track.
I will add to that. That is where I come in as well. So if anybody has a passion for this area in particular, we are always open to discussing how we can grow those programs, and don't necessarily have the ability to add curriculum or curricula, but I can at least help sort of funnel some of the resources out there to support some of these very pressing needs. Okay, we have one more question from Chase. Chase, if you want to go ahead and unmute yourself, and you'll be our last question. We're a little bit over, so we understand that folks need to head out. So if anybody needs to drop off, we understand and appreciate you being here. We'll send a survey afterwards and make sure that we get those responses. Thank you, guys. So go ahead and Chase, I'll get you.
Okay, so my last question is more of an opinion-based question for Emma, but I was wondering if through your research, if it kind of gave you an opinion on Western involvement in African country wildlife management, because I know when we were over there, Dr. Verena especially talked about how a lot of Native Africans get, pissy, for lack of a better word, about Westerners coming in and trying to invoke our own ideas and how we think things should be done. What are your thoughts on it now that you've done all this research?
Absolutely. Yeah. And that was definitely something that when I kind of briefly mentioned at the end where we need to pay attention to where our aid and how we provide aid is going, I was kind of alluding to that topic. So I'm glad you brought it up. But yes, because there's definitely an issue, and I completely understand the sentiments of a lot of these communities feeling like Americans, like I said, we're very removed from the issue itself and its direct effects on people, trying to affect the policy and state what we feel is the best opinion on their policy, which is why I feel like focusing on those community-based approaches and therefore supporting the communities themselves is the best way to support these species, rather than coming in and trying to enforce what we view as the best model upon them. We can instead look at them, maybe provide suggestions, but not necessarily declaring that we have the ultimately better perspective of it as being removed over here. Maybe making recommendations, making suggestions, as a lot of those countries are already in political unrest, so that makes it very challenging for them to just develop strong policy maybe to build off of. So if we can support the governments or support the communities themselves, that is then therefore going to go back to protect the species. And that's also why I think just education is an important aspect too, like having people from the general public have this understanding of it, that we are removed and we are removed, but we still want to help somehow, and then putting our aid into the actual communities and the models that we examine that are actually making that positive difference. So does that fully answer your question?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, good. But thank you for bringing that up. That's a very important thing to keep in mind with all this.
Terrific. All right, I think that's all the questions that we have, and we certainly appreciate everyone joining us today. Emma, that was wonderful. I'll give you a Zoom round of applause here.
I appreciate it.
Thank you guys all. We'll send a follow-up email, and if anybody has any follow-up questions, you're welcome to email me, and I can pass them along to Emma and get you in touch with her. We know you're going places, ma'am, so we'll look forward to seeing where you wind up next.
I really appreciate it. And thank you again, everyone that attended. This was probably 3 times as many people that I thought would even be here today, so much appreciated.
Thank you, Emma.
Thanks.
Thank you. And then one last shout out to Dr. Logan and Dr. Cook and Dr. Durr that gave me the opportunity, and that I would not be talking about this today without that opportunity. So thanks again.
Our pleasure.
Wonderful. Thank you.